Some bells toll for worship, but others summon only fear. This tale begins in the ancient heart of Oxford, where 3 centuries-old bells ring of their own accord, each stroke followed by calamity, disappearance, fire, and death. Superstition whispers of curses, yet Holmes perceives a darker hand behind the tolling. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The mystery waits within the cloisters of St. Athanasius. Let us follow Holmes as he unmasks the truth. It was upon one of those evenings of late autumn, when the London fog clung with peculiar density to the panes of our sitting-room windows, that I found myself in a mood of reflective repose. Holmes, as was his wont when the world provided no worthy challenge, had buried himself in a series of chemical experiments, the pungent odour of reagents hanging thick in the air. I reclined in my armchair with a medical journal upon my knee, though I must confess that my thoughts wandered frequently to the prospect of a quiet pipe and the simple comfort of our hearth. The familiar ticking of the clock and the occasional clink of glass from Holmes's test tubes formed the only accompaniment to the silence, and I had resigned myself to an evening of domestic tranquillity when the sharp rattle of carriage wheels outside broke upon our ears. The sound was followed, almost immediately, by a firm knock upon the door below. Holmes raised his head, his keen features animated with that peculiar expectancy which any interruption, however slight, invariably aroused in him. "A visitor, Watson," said he, wiping his hands upon a cloth, "and if I mistake not, one who comes upon an errand of no ordinary character." Even before Mrs. Hudson's step sounded upon the stair, I had felt the same conviction. The hour was unusual, the knock resolute. Something in the very cadence of those approaching footsteps presaged an unfolding mystery. The door opened, and Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall, thin gentleman, whose grave aspect proclaimed at once the seriousness of his errand. His clerical collar and the scholarly stoop of his shoulders bespoke the ecclesiastic and the man of letters, while his pallid complexion and trembling hands betrayed the strain of recent agitation. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his voice pitched low, as though conscious of unseen listeners. "My name is Holmes. Pray, be seated, sir," returned my companion, indicating the chair opposite him with a courteous gesture. "And this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. You are in some perplexity which demands our aid." The stranger inclined his head. "Reverend Dr. Alistair Henslow, Fellow of St. Athanasius College, Oxford. I come to you in the gravest distress. A matter has arisen within our ancient walls which threatens not merely our peace, but perhaps even our very lives." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. "Then you have chosen well in bringing your difficulty. Here, Dr. Henslow, lay before us the particulars without reserve. I perceive already that the burden you bear is of no trifling weight." Dr. Henslow clasped his thin hands upon his knees and drew a deep breath before speaking. "You may have heard, Mr. Holmes, of the 3 bells of St. Athanasius, relics of a bygone age, which hang within the chapel tower of our college. Cast, as tradition tells, in the 15th century, they have ever been invested with a certain aura of superstition. Each is said to represent a solemn mystery. The first, mortality; the second, judgment; and the third, eternity itself. Now, it has long been whispered among scholars and townsfolk alike that the tolling of these bells at unbidden hours portends misfortune. Though the story has often been dismissed as the fancy of credulous generations, it retains a tenacious hold upon the imagination of Oxford. For centuries, they have stood silent save at appointed services, and we regarded the tale with tolerant indulgence. Yet of late, sir, events have lent a darker significance to the legend. The bells have tolled at midnight of their own accord, though no hand has touched the ropes, and with each toll, calamity has fallen upon us." Holmes's eyes narrowed in the lamplight, while I confess a chill ran through me at the clergyman's words. There was in his voice no hint of exaggeration, only the weary cadence of one compelled to acknowledge that which he would rather not believe. "The first toll," Henslow continued, "was followed within hours by the disappearance of a promising student, young Mr. Cyril Ashcombe. He was last seen within the cloisters, but no trace of him has since been found, though the river and countryside have been searched exhaustively. The second toll came scarcely a fortnight later. That very night, the college library, repository of our most treasured manuscripts, was consumed by a fire whose origin remains obscure. Though much was saved, priceless volumes were irreparably lost. And the third. Here Henslow's voice faltered, and for a moment he covered his face with his hands. The third bell tolled but 3 nights past. The following morning our venerable bursar, Mr. Erasmus Prynne, was discovered lifeless in the cloisters, stricken, so the physician declared, by apoplexy. I was among the first to see him, and I cannot dismiss from my mind the ghastly expression of terror which seemed frozen upon his features. Holmes steepled his fingers and regarded the clergyman with unblinking intensity. "You present a sequence, sir, which in less experienced hands might be dismissed as coincidence. Yet coincidence, thrice repeated, demands explanation. Pray proceed." For myself, I could scarce conceal a shudder. The combination of vanished youth, desecrated learning, and sudden death cast a pall over our snug chamber, as though the shadow of that ancient college had fallen upon Baker Street itself. The college, said Dr. Henslow, is riven by dread. Some declare that the old legend has awakened, that the bells herald judgment upon us for hidden sins. Students dare not walk alone at night, and even my colleagues whisper of curses. I fear that panic may soon overwhelm reason. And yet, if these visitations are the work of human agency, then we are in the presence of a cunning and merciless adversary. Holmes's lip curled ever so slightly. Superstition is the enemy's surest ally. When reason sleeps, villainy flourishes unchecked. You are right to seek assistance, Doctor, for whether spectral or human there is a hand at work, and I mean to unmask it. At these words, some measure of relief passed across the clergyman's drawn countenance, though his eyes still flickered with apprehension. Holmes rose and laid a hand lightly upon Henslow's arm. "You shall return to Oxford with the assurance that we will follow swiftly upon your steps. There are particulars in your account which speak louder to me than to others. Certain discrepancies, though slight, are eloquent to an instructed ear. Leave them in my care." Turning to me, he added with quiet firmness, "Watson, prepare yourself. We set forth for Oxford with the dawn." Thus began one of the strangest cases it has ever been my lot to record, wherein superstition and scholarship alike were made the mask of crime. True to Holmes's word, we quitted Baker Street with the earliest light of dawn. Dr. Henslow had preceded us by the night train, yet his grave countenance lingered in my memory as we took our seats. Holmes, silent and absorbed, gazed steadfastly through the mist-streaked window, his long fingers drumming a measured rhythm upon his knee. I knew well these signs. His mind, keen as tempered steel, was already engaged upon the problem. For my part, I could not shake a sense of unease. The legend of the bells, with its sombre tolling and the sequence of calamities, returned again and again to my thoughts. Holmes, perceiving perhaps my abstraction, remarked at length, "You will find, Watson, that the hand which guides these events is no spirit's, but a man's, and a most ingenious one. The true problem lies not in the bells that ring, but in the silence which surrounds them." He would say no more, and thus we sped toward Oxford, my companion buried in contemplation, while I pondered with mingled apprehension and anticipation the adventure into which we were plunged. It was nearing dusk when our carriage drew into the Oxford station. A moist fog hung low over the meadows, and the spires and towers of the colleges loomed faintly through the haze, like solemn sentinels from another age. The narrow streets, echoing to the tread of countless generations, seemed steeped in memories of scholarship and devotion. Holmes regarded the scene with that quiet detachment which cloaked his keenest impressions. For myself, there was something profoundly stirring in the union of beauty and antiquity which lay before us. The bells, whose sinister reputation we had heard so vividly described, now seemed almost to brood over the venerable roofs with spectral weight. As we crossed the quadrangle of St. Athanasius College, I noted the lamplight flickering against worn stone, the hush of cloisters broken only by the rustle of gowns and a pervading sense of apprehension. Though the stones were ancient, the mood was of a household awaiting calamity. Holmes cast a swift glance upward at the chapel tower, where three dark shapes, just visible through the gloom, hung silent and heavy. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "It is not the grandeur of the bells that is of import, but the contrivances by which they are moved." We were soon received by two of the college officials. The bursar, a tall man with features set in austere lines, greeted us with grave courtesy, though his tone conveyed more concern for the institution's dignity than for truth itself. "The college has ever stood above idle gossip," he declared. "We must preserve that repute at any cost." In contrast, the aged porter who accompanied him betrayed a very different spirit. His voice dropped to a whisper as he addressed Holmes, his eyes darting fearfully toward the chapel. "It is no jest, sir. The bells do ring of their own will, and misfortune follows close upon. I have seen the ropes stir when no hand was near." Holmes inclined his head gravely, neither scoffing nor assenting. "I thank you, gentlemen," said he. "The facts are what we seek, not opinions. Yet I note with interest that one of you perceives peril where the other perceives only scandal." The bursar flushed and made no reply, but Holmes's remark lingered with me. Here already was division, the seeds of mistrust within the very walls of this venerable college. Not long after, we were introduced to Dr. Mortlake, one of the senior dons. He was a man of confident bearing and fluent tongue, whose first words were directed not at Holmes, but at Henslow, with a sardonic smile. "My dear fellow, I see you have gone to the very heart of melodrama. Bells tolling by themselves, curses revived from the Middle Ages. Surely you do not expect men of learning to credit such fancies." Holmes regarded him with his inscrutable gaze. "Then you perceive no mystery in three calamities, each preceded by a tolling bell?" "Coincidence, sir," Mortlake returned with a shrug. "The human mind is apt to trace patterns where none exist." Holmes made no rejoinder, but I saw the quick gleam in his eye, which told me that Mortlake's eagerness to dismiss the matter had not passed unnoticed. Later, as we left the hall, Holmes muttered, "When a man denies too vehemently, Watson, it is seldom the truth alone that he defends." That night, by arrangement with Dr. Henslow, we joined a small group of fellows and servants beneath the chapel tower. The ropes which hung down from the bells were plainly in view, each one carefully observed lest some prank or trick be attempted. A hush fell upon the assembly, broken only by the occasional clearing of a throat or the shuffling of a foot upon the flagstones. Watson's pen could scarcely capture the tension of that vigil. Every minute seemed to stretch into an hour, while the shadow of the great tower loomed above us like some gigantic sentinel. The bursar stood stiffly, his lips compressed, while the porter's eyes rolled nervously at every sound. Holmes remained as calm as a physician in his surgery, his gaze fixed now upon the ropes, now upon the stairwell, and now upon the faces of the company. As the clock crept toward midnight, I confess that a chill passed through me, not of cold, but of anticipation. Henslow's pale features bore witness to a similar struggle between faith and fear. The silence was absolute, as though the very air awaited the stroke. Holmes whispered softly, "Steady, Watson. Let us see whether phantoms or men will answer the hour." At the instant when the clock proclaimed the hour, the silence was shattered by a deep, resonant note. One of the three bells swung and tolled, though every eye confirmed that no hand had stirred the rope. A cry of terror broke from the porter, and even the austere bursar staggered back with a gasp. I confess that my own heart leapt, for the sound seemed invested with an unearthly power. The solemn boom reverberated across the quadrangle, stirring the ancient stones to echo. Yet Holmes did not flinch. His keen eyes darted upward, then swiftly downward, and his lips compressed in satisfaction rather than alarm. When the echoes had died and the assembly dispersed in whispered agitation, Holmes remained behind. He bent over the ropes with his lantern, examining each with meticulous care. "Note this, Watson," he said at length, pointing to a faint smear of soot upon the fibres. "And here, upon the flagstones, the scuff of a boot. Recent, though lightly made." He moved toward the stairwell, tracing with his fingertips the worn edge of the stone. A hidden passage, perhaps, or at least a vantage not known to the rest. Our midnight bell ringer is no phantom, but a man who trusts in terror more than truth. I marvelled at his composure, for while others trembled under the spell of superstition, Holmes treated the phenomenon as a surgeon might a curious malady, something to be dissected, understood, and ultimately mastered. "Come, Watson," he said, straightening at last. "The bells toll for those who fear them. For us, they ring only of opportunity." Our first inquiries were directed among the undergraduates, many of whom we encountered pacing the cloisters in uneasy knots, their voices subdued as though fearful of attracting unwelcome notice. It required little prompting for their apprehensions to emerge, and I was struck by the unanimity of their conviction that some malign influence stalked the college at night. One pale youth, his cap clutched nervously between his fingers, confided to us that, on the evening preceding the bursar's collapse, he had glimpsed a hooded figure stealing from the direction of the bell tower. The apparition had glided swiftly through the shadows and vanished toward the gardens before the young man's courage permitted him to give chase. Was the figure tall or short, lame or straight? Holmes pressed him. "Neither tall nor small, sir, rather of middle height. The cloak concealed the rest. I remember only the swiftness of his movement." Holmes regarded the trembling student with his customary coolness. "You did well to observe as much as you did. Fear clouds the vision as surely as darkness." As the young man withdrew, Holmes turned to me. "Mark it, Watson. We have the first witness to a flesh-and-blood intruder, not a phantom tolling bells from the grave." From the cloisters, we proceeded to the chambers of Cyril Ashcombe, the missing student whose fate weighed heavily upon Dr. Henslow's conscience. The room bore the unmistakable stamp of an eager, if somewhat erratic, mind. Books lay strewn upon the desk, while loose papers littered the floor. Holmes moved swiftly, his keen eye darting from object to object. "Observe here," said he, lifting a notebook covered in hasty jottings. The pages were filled with curious sketches of the bell tower, diagrams of pulleys and wheels, and strings of letters arranged in a ciphered form. Here we have, at the very least, an inquisitive nature. The boy had fastened upon the mystery of the bells. Among the debris, Holmes unearthed a scrap of parchment bearing a crude drawing of 3 interlinked circles, beneath which was scrawled the phrase, "Clavis ad portum." "The key to the gate," Holmes translated quietly. What gate, and to what it opens, remains to be seen, but I suspect this clue cost young Ashcombe dear. I confess that a chill seized me at the thought of the vanished scholar pursuing knowledge which had drawn him, unwittingly, into the grasp of a merciless foe. That same evening we supped with several of the dons, where the conversation, though outwardly courteous, revealed currents of ill will which Holmes was quick to perceive. The rivalries of academic life, which to the outsider may seem trifling, often possess the intensity of political feuds. Here, they were sharpened by questions of inheritance, prestige, and professional ambition. I observed that when the name of Mortlake was mentioned, certain glances were exchanged, and a silence, heavy with meaning, fell upon the table. Later, as we withdrew, Holmes remarked, "Note, Watson, how envy and rivalry eat at the fabric of this college as surely as damp corrodes stone. In such soil villainy takes root." Indeed, there were whispers that one fellowship, long contested, was soon to fall vacant, and that jealousies had already been inflamed over the bursar's supposed favouritism. More than once, I caught Holmes's gaze fixed upon the faces around him, as though weighing their expressions with an invisible balance. It was clear to me that the mystery of the bells could not be severed from the human passions which surged beneath the academic calm. The dons of St. Athanasius, for all their gowns and learning, were men, and men are ever susceptible to ambition. In the days that followed, I heard rumours, repeated in guarded tones, which pointed to yet another source of corruption within those venerable walls. It was said that rare manuscripts, some of dubious provenance, had found their way into the possession of certain dons, and that clandestine dealings in such treasures were not unknown. Holmes listened attentively to these murmurings, his expression betraying neither surprise nor judgment. At last he remarked, "It is an old truth, Watson, that the scholar's hunger for knowledge is oft matched by his hunger for possession. A parchment may tempt more strongly than gold when its lines promise fame to him who claims them." It was whispered further that Ashcombe, in his zeal for discovery, may have stumbled upon evidence of such transactions, thereby drawing the attention of those whose reputations depended upon secrecy. I could not but feel a deep unease as I set these matters down. The thought that men dedicated to learning might stoop to such devices troubled me profoundly. Holmes, however, only drew more closely into himself, as though the very complexity of the case afforded him a grim satisfaction. "Superstition, rivalry, greed," he murmured at length. "These are the true bells that toll within St. Athanasius." In the days which followed our first inquiries, I observed a marked change in the demeanour of all who dwelt within the college. Students who had once loitered cheerfully in the quadrangles now hurried with bent heads and furtive glances, as though fearing some invisible pursuer. The long corridors echoed less with laughter than with whispers, and the faintest creak of the chapel tower seemed sufficient to send them scurrying indoors. The staff, too, bore the signs of a mounting strain. The porter, when questioned, admitted that he dared not pass the chapel at night. Even the most rational of the dons betrayed a furtive uneasiness, their conversations turning ever toward the bells, as if no other topic could command attention. A curious atmosphere of guilt seemed to hang about the college, though whether born of conscience or superstition, I could not then determine. For my part, the sombre shadow of the place weighed heavily upon my spirits. I found myself listening at night for the dreaded toll, and more than once awoke with the sound of phantom bells reverberating in my dreams. Holmes alone appeared untouched. His calm, methodical bearing offered the only anchor amidst the spreading tide of fear. One evening, as I confessed to Holmes the oppressive effect which the atmosphere of the college was exerting upon me, he regarded me with that faint smile of indulgence which I had so often encountered. "Courage, Watson," said he. "The weight you feel is not of ghosts, but of guilty consciences. Consider, the porter declares he saw the ropes stir when none touched them. Yet his testimony conflicts with the accounts of two fellows who maintained that the bells rang while the ropes lay still. The student who glimpsed a hooded figure swears to his direction of flight, which directly contradicts the porter's account of the same hour. These inconsistencies are not accidents, they are planted." He drew from his pocket one of Ashcombe's coded papers, upon which he had been making penciled notes. "Observe, too, how these symbols point toward a mechanism hidden within the tower. The superstition is but a cloak, designed to terrify the ignorant, while the true hand works unobserved." His words, delivered in that cool and certain tone, restored my shaken spirits. The darkness which brooded over St. Athanasius seemed less spectral, more human, an evil born not of the supernatural, but of deliberate design. Holmes's eyes shone with the light of battle. It was upon the third evening of our stay that the dread event occurred, which threw the whole college into confusion. We were in the refectory with several fellows, engaged in sombre conversation, when the solemn boom of a bell echoed suddenly across the quadrangle. A hush fell, broken only by the hurried tread of feet rushing toward the cloisters. There, beneath the shadow of the tower, we found the bursar, Mr. Prynne, leaning heavily against a pillar. His face was ashen, his lips drawn back in a ghastly rictus, and even as we reached him, he slid to the ground with a low moan. Cries of horror rang out, and more than one voice whispered of judgment and curse. Holmes, however, dropped instantly to his knees beside the stricken man. His hand, steady as ever, touched the lips and examined the skin. "Observe, Watson," he murmured low, "the faint discoloration about the mouth, the rigidity of the jaw. No stroke, but poison, swift and subtle." The college physician, arriving breathlessly, declared apoplexy, but Holmes rose with quiet certainty. "You may call it what you will, sir, yet I assure you this man is the victim of a deliberate hand." As Prynne was carried away lifeless, terror spread like wildfire. The tolling of the bell had claimed another, and superstition now gripped even the most skeptical. But in Holmes's countenance I saw no fear, only the gleam of a hunter who has caught the scent of his quarry. By the following morning, the college was rife with rumour, and suspicion had already fastened itself upon a convenient target. It was whispered that certain rebellious undergraduates, long resentful of the bursar's strict discipline, had conspired to bring about his ruin. Their nocturnal revels, their disdain for authority, and their frequent quarrels with Prynne furnished ample ground for the charge. Several fellows seized upon this explanation with almost indecent eagerness, and I could not help but perceive in their readiness a desire to divert suspicion from their own circle. The students themselves, when questioned, protested their innocence with fiery indignation, yet the taint of blame clung to them, poisoning their reputations. Holmes listened with polite attention, but no credence. Later, as we walked the cloisters, he remarked to me in a low tone, "Convenience, Watson, is the most treacherous guide to truth. These young men are noisy, foolish, perhaps insolent, but poisoners they are not. When guilt points too directly, it is generally because a hand has guided it so." I was struck anew by Holmes's instinct to look beyond the obvious, and I began to suspect that the true culprit moved among the dons themselves, cloaked by the very dignity of their office. Holmes, unsatisfied with conjecture, demanded that we examine the undercroft of the chapel, a place seldom visited save by vergers and masons. Lantern in hand, we descended into the chill gloom beneath the tower. The air was heavy with the odour of dust and old stone, and our steps echoed ominously along the vaulted chamber. Holmes moved swiftly, his keen gaze sweeping the walls and floor. Presently, he halted before a recess half concealed by rubble. "Here, Watson, lies the heart of our mystery." He drew aside the debris to reveal a set of ancient wheels and pulleys, cunningly reassembled and linked to the bell ropes above. The workmanship bore marks of recent handling, the wood polished by use, the metal faintly oiled. "It is by such means," said he, "that our invisible hand tolls the bells, not spirits, but contrivance." I confess to a thrill of mingled relief and horror. Relief that the supernatural explanation was dispelled. Horror that some calculating villain had restored these forgotten devices for his own dark ends. Holmes straightened, his eyes alight. "Mark my words, Watson, here we touch the mechanism of terror. Yet there is artifice still. Someone desires us to look one way while he moves another." As we quitted the crypt, Holmes's countenance bore that expression of restrained energy which I had come to associate with the moment when a tangled skein first begins to yield beneath his fingers. "Observe, Watson," said he, "how conveniently suspicion has fallen upon the students. Their quarrels with the bursar, their pranks, their indiscretions, all make them likely scapegoats. Yet when suspicion points so directly, it is often guided by an unseen hand." I protested that the circumstantial evidence was considerable, the students' hostility, their proximity to the tower, and the bursar's well-known severity. "Exactly so," Holmes returned. "Too considerable, too well arranged. You forget the soot upon the rope, the mechanism in the crypt, and the contradictions in testimony. These things do not speak of youthful mischief, but of deliberate planning. A cunning adversary weaves false trails, knowing that the eye of the multitude follows the obvious, while truth lies hidden in the shadow. I could not but feel a chill at his words, for it seemed that each step brought us closer, not to illumination, but to a darkness more profound. That same night, returning from our rounds of inquiry, I was seized by the uncomfortable conviction that we were not alone in the cloisters. The pale moonlight fell upon the stone arches, and in the shifting interplay of shadow and light, I caught the fleeting glimpse of a figure which melted away at our approach. Twice I quickened my step, only to find the passage empty, the silence unbroken save for the echo of our own tread. Yet the impression of being observed clung to me with an insistence I could not shake. Holmes, perceiving my unease, gave a slight nod. "You are not mistaken, Watson. We are watched. That fact, instead of alarming me, is of the utmost encouragement. A guilty hand does not watch idly, it watches in fear." As we turned the final angle of the cloister, a shadow detached itself and slipped soundlessly into the gardens beyond. I confess, I felt a thrill of dread, as though the walls themselves had given up a phantom. Holmes, however, only drew his coat more closely about him, his keen eyes shining with quiet anticipation. The next morning, as the dons exchanged anxious glances and the students whispered darkly of curses, Holmes alone remained unmoved. He sat in the refectory with his coffee untasted, his gaze fixed upon the tower visible through the narrow window. "You perceive terror and confusion around you, Watson," he remarked at last. "Yet I perceive order, a deliberate sequence. The bell tolls, calamity follows, suspicion is planted, and fear spreads. Each act is calculated, as precise as the notes of a composition. Superstition is but the music sheet. The true hand lies behind, conducting the piece to his own design." His calmness, set against the general panic, restored to me some measure of confidence. I began to comprehend that beneath the cloak of dread there moved a mind, ingenious and ruthless, which Holmes had already begun to trace. "Take heart, my dear fellow," he added. "We are no longer groping in the dark. The pattern reveals itself, and soon the hand." It was on the following evening that Holmes, after a day spent in silent calculation and furtive inspection of the grounds, disclosed to me his intention of setting a snare for the unseen hand that had so long eluded detection. He summoned me to our chambers with that peculiar light in his eye which bespoke the imminence of decisive action. "Watson," said he, "the third bell is due to toll this night, if our adversary maintains the pattern. I propose that we, not he, shall control the conditions under which it rings." He then unfolded his plan with characteristic brevity. Certain lanterns were to be placed at strategic angles within the cloisters, casting light upon the stairways and passages by which approach to the tower might be attempted. He instructed me in the concealment of one lamp behind a stone buttress, while he himself arranged another to fall obliquely upon the ropes. "These fellows," he remarked, "trust in shadow and dread. We shall answer them with illumination and certainty. When the bell tolls, the culprit must approach his device. We shall be waiting." I marvelled at the quiet precision with which every detail had been anticipated. Though the peril was real, Holmes's calm assurance infused me with confidence, and I felt, as often before, the exhilaration of standing upon the threshold of discovery. As the appointed hour drew near, Holmes and I stationed ourselves beneath the tower. The lanterns were lit, their beams cutting through the gloom in narrow shafts, while the rest of the college lay steeped in shadow. A chill crept through the stone, and the silence seemed so profound that the faintest rustle assumed the magnitude of thunder. I confess that my nerves were strained to the utmost. Each creak of timber, each sigh of the wind through the arches, caused me to start involuntarily. Yet Holmes stood motionless, his lean figure erect, his eyes fixed with unwavering intensity upon the ropes that dangled from above. His very stillness seemed to master the oppressive silence. Minute succeeded minute with intolerable slowness. At times I fancied I could hear the beating of my own heart more loudly than the clock. Holmes touched my arm but once, as if to remind me of his presence. His calmness was in marked contrast to the atmosphere of dread which pressed upon every sense. Thus we waited, 2 watches in the night, poised between reason and superstition, until the hour should strike and the mystery declare itself. When at last the college clock tolled midnight, its measured strokes had scarcely died upon the air when a deeper, more sonorous sound welled forth from above. One of the ancient bells, vast and solemn, swung upon its beam. The ropes, plain to our sight, remained motionless, yet the clangor spread through the quadrangle with a force that seemed to shake the very stones. I cannot deny the shudder which passed through me as that eerie resonance filled the night. It was as though the centuries themselves had found a voice to proclaim judgment upon the living. The fellows gathered at a distance recoiled in terror, and more than one fled the scene with cries of alarm. Holmes, however, betrayed no such weakness. His eyes blazed as he watched the tower. "Steady, Watson," he whispered. "This is the moment we awaited." The bell continued its unnatural tolling, the note rising and falling with dreadful majesty. Yet beneath that sound I detected another, soft, furtive, almost inaudible, the scrape of a foot upon stone. Holmes's hand closed upon my wrist. "There," he breathed. "The hand behind the bell reveals itself at last." Even as he spoke, a shadow detached itself from the stairwell, moving swiftly but with deliberate caution. The figure seemed to melt from one patch of darkness to another, intent upon escaping notice. But Holmes, who had prepared for this very instant, was already in motion. With the quick gesture of a huntsman signalling his hound, Holmes directed me toward the cloister wall, while he himself glided noiselessly into the path of the intruder. The lantern light caught for an instant upon a cloak drawn tightly about the shoulders of the figure, whose every movement spoke not of fear, but of calculation. The fellow paused, perceiving, perhaps too late, that his accustomed shadows were broken by unfamiliar beams. In that instant, Holmes stepped forward, his hand outstretched with the certainty of a man who has rehearsed the encounter in his mind 100 times. "Stand fast, sir," he commanded, his voice ringing clear above the echo of the bells. The figure started, wheeled, and made to retreat, but Holmes was upon him with the swiftness of a striking hawk. I hastened to his side, my heart pounding with the fierce thrill of pursuit. The cloak slipped, and for the first time I beheld the pale, sharp features of a man I recognized from the common table of the Dons. It was no phantom, but flesh and blood, our adversary revealed. The fellow, perceiving himself discovered, wrenched free with a violence that startled me, and dashed headlong across the cloister. Holmes, agile as a cat, was after him in an instant, and I followed with what vigour I could muster. The night air rang with the sound of our pursuit, the echoes of our feet rebounding from stone to stone like the roll of distant drums. The fugitive darted through the quadrangle, his cloak billowing like the wings of some great bird of prey. He swerved among statues and arches with the practised swiftness of one who knew every turn of the college grounds. Twice we nearly lost him, once when he slipped behind a row of hedges, again when he plunged into a shadowed passageway. But Holmes pressed on with unrelenting determination, his figure a dark streak against the dim lamplight. Students, roused from their chambers by the tumult, peered in astonishment from the windows, their cries adding confusion to the chase. Yet the hunted man gave no pause, his pace driven by desperation, while the tolling bells still reverberated above like some monstrous herald of doom. At last, he stumbled upon the slick grass of the gardens, and I gained ground, breathless but resolved. Holmes, with the precision of a huntsman, closing upon his quarry, drove him toward a stone wall which barred his escape. There, beneath the looming shadow of the chapel, the intruder was brought to bay. Cornered, the man turned at bay, his chest heaving, his eyes flashing with the wildness of one who knows the game is lost. Holmes advanced a pace, his hand outstretched with quiet authority. "Enough, Dr. Mortlake," said he. "The pursuit is ended." At these words the cloak fell aside, revealing the pallid intellectual features of the very Don who had dismissed the bells as superstition with such confident disdain. For an instant he stood defiant, then, as if the weight of Holmes's certainty crushed his resistance, he sank against the wall with a bitter laugh. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes," he muttered, "but you have meddled in affairs beyond your comprehension." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "On the contrary, sir, the tolling of the bells, the poisoned bursar, the vanished student, each was but a move in your design. You sought to cloak your ambition in fear, and in so doing betrayed yourself." I confess that a pang of astonishment swept through me. Mortlake, with his lofty manner and assured speech, seemed the last man to stoop to crime. Yet in that moment, stripped of pretense, he appeared less a scholar than a cornered beast, his intellect turned against itself by avarice and resentment. Holmes, addressing the assembled dons who had by now gathered in hushed awe, spoke with measured clarity. "The motive is plain. Within your library lay a manuscript of inestimable value, an illuminated chronicle whose discovery would secure fame and fortune for its possessor. Dr. Mortlake, coveting that prize, contrived to eliminate those who barred his way. The bells, ingeniously manipulated by hidden mechanisms, served to spread terror, while poison silenced opposition. The missing student, young Ashcombe, had stumbled upon his design and was made to vanish." A murmur of horror passed through the company, while Mortlake lowered his head, the last pretense stripped away. Holmes concluded, his voice grave yet calm. "Thus the bells told, not of judgment, but of greed, and the hand that pulled their unseen cords is here revealed." By the following evening, the great hall of St. Athanasius College had become the stage for the final act of this strange drama. The fellows, grave and silent, were seated along the oaken tables, while a number of students and servants pressed into the background, their faces pale with expectation. At the head of the assembly, Dr. Henslow presided with visible agitation, his eyes never straying far from Holmes. I confess that I felt a curious thrill as I took my place beside my companion. There was in the air a mingling of awe, resentment, and relief. Each man present seemed to sense that the hour of revelation was at hand. Mortlake, closely guarded, stood apart, his arms folded and his head bowed, though a flicker of defiance still lingered about his lips. Holmes, perfectly composed, surveyed the company with that air of quiet mastery which none could resist. "Gentlemen," said he, his voice carrying to the farthest recess of the hall, "you have been witnesses to events which have clothed themselves in the guise of superstition, but which are in truth the product of human cunning. It is my duty now to lay bare the machinery of deceit and to show how the tolling of the bells was made the herald of crime." The hush which followed was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the great hearth, as all eyes fixed upon Holmes in breathless anticipation. Holmes began by producing from his pocket a roll of parchment, yellowed with age, upon which were drawn the architectural plans of the chapel tower. "Here," he said, "are the blueprints of St. Athanasius, forgotten by most, but rediscovered by Dr. Mortlake in the archives. They reveal the existence of a set of auxiliary pulleys and wheels in the crypt, long disused but capable of manipulation. These contrivances, restored with modern cunning, allowed the bells to be swung from below by one who knew the system, without the ropes themselves betraying movement. Thus, the illusion was perfect. The eye saw nothing, yet the ear was assailed by sound." He then described, with the utmost clarity, the traces of oil upon the wood, the marks of recent repair, and the soot upon the ropes. Each of these was eloquent. It is the smallest detail, gentlemen, which betrays the greatest secret. The mechanism was employed not once, but thrice, to coincide with calamity, thereby clothing misfortune in the vesture of prophecy. A murmur ran through the assembly, as the dons leaned forward, some in incredulity, others in shame. Holmes continued, "The so-called supernatural tolling was thus no marvel of the spirit world, but the deliberate work of Mortlake, who sought to terrify the college into submission while he pursued his own designs. To him, superstition was a weapon, more potent than blade or bullet, wielded through the very bells which tradition had made the guardians of fate. The effect of his words was electric. I could see in the eyes of the company the first dawning comprehension that they had been duped not by phantoms, but by human hands. Holmes allowed the murmurs to subside before he resumed, his tone now grave with emphasis. You will have noted, gentlemen, that each toll of the bell was accompanied by disaster. The disappearance of the student Ashcombe, the burning of the library, the sudden death of the bursar. These were no accidents, but deliberate stages in a scheme. The bell was the signal, the calamity, the consequence. By such means, Dr. Mortlake contrived to weave a legend anew, so that every man within these walls should believe the curse of the bells revived. Fear clouded judgment, and in that darkness he moved unobserved. Each toll was but a curtain, behind which he struck his blow. I observed the effect of this reasoning upon the assembly. Some covered their faces in shame, others exchanged glances heavy with dread. As for Mortlake himself, he smiled faintly, as though perversely gratified by the magnitude of his deception. Holmes, unshaken, concluded, "Superstition, gentlemen, is a cloak woven of ignorance." Mortlake wrapped himself in that cloak, and while you trembled, he pursued his prize. The calamities were not the heralds of fate, but the instruments of design as cold and merciless as the hand that executed it. A deep silence followed, laden with the weight of truth. Holmes next turned to the matter of the unfortunate youth, whose absence had cast the first shadow upon the college. "The fate of Cyril Ashcombe," said he, "is unhappily clear. The lad was inquisitive, with a taste for puzzles. His notebooks, as you know, contained ciphers and diagrams which mirrored the very contrivances Mortlake employed. He had, in short, stumbled upon the truth. He deciphered enough to suspect that the bells did not toll by miracle, but by design. In his zeal, he confronted that danger which his youth rendered him ill-equipped to meet. Mortlake, perceiving the risk, silenced him. Whether by persuasion to depart, or by darker means which the river may yet conceal, I cannot with certainty declare. But that Ashcombe paid the penalty of knowledge is beyond doubt." A gasp arose from several students, for the missing scholar had been well liked. Holmes's tone softened as he added, "The boy was no victim of ghosts, but of human cunning. Let that remembrance dispel the terror which has lain upon you. Superstition killed no man. Mortlake did." Holmes then drew forth a small, fire-scorched volume, rescued from the ashes of the library. "Here," said he, "is the centerpiece of Mortlake's design." The college possessed an illuminated manuscript, older than the Reformation, which had lain unnoticed in the archives. Its rediscovery promised not only fame in the learned world, but also vast pecuniary gain to him who could claim it as his own. Mortlake, ambitious beyond the bounds of honour, resolved to make that prize his. The tolling of the bells, the spreading of fear, the death of the bursar, these were not random tragedies, but calculated steps towards securing access to the manuscript. By terrorising his colleagues, he weakened their vigilance, while by removing opponents he cleared his path. I could not but note the visible shame upon the faces of the dons. That one of their number should have perverted scholarship into a cloak for crime was a bitter draught. Yet Holmes, with his implacable logic, stripped the matter of sentiment. This, gentleman, was not the work of an avenger from the past, but of an ambitious man who cloaked greed in legend. The bells were but his instrument. Holmes now addressed the chain of evidence. You will recall the soot upon the rope. That soot, gentlemen, betrayed the friction of a wheel newly oiled and put to service. The scuff marks upon the stair, left by Mortlake's boots, proved the passage was used when all others were locked. The bursar's lips bore the telltale stain of a subtle poison, no stroke of apoplexy, and the testimonies which accused the students, too uniform, too patently rehearsed, to be aught but invention. He paused, allowing the significance of each detail to sink in. To the untrained eye, these were fragments, meaningless in themselves. To me, they formed a mosaic, and in that mosaic, gentlemen, there was but one portrait, Mortlake's. The company sat in stunned silence, the chain complete, the illusion dissolved. As Holmes concluded, a hush lay over the hall, broken only by the crackle of the fire. I looked upon my friend with admiration, not unmixed with awe. In the space of an hour, he had dispelled the mists of superstition and laid bare the simple, dreadful truth. Where others had trembled before phantoms, he had seen only mechanisms, motives, and men. It seemed to me then that reason itself had tolled the final bell, proclaiming the triumph of knowledge over fear. And in that triumph, Oxford was delivered. The capture of Dr. Mortlake, though accomplished without bloodshed, sent a palpable tremor through the company of dons and students who assembled in the quadrangle that night. That the man who had so recently dismissed the matter with lofty disdain should stand now, pale and unstrung, in the grasp of the constabulary, seemed scarcely credible to his colleagues. His composure, which had long been mistaken for strength of intellect, crumbled before our eyes. He protested at first with haughty indignation, then lapsed into sullen silence, his gaze fixed upon the ground. Holmes, impassive as ever, merely observed, "The mask of learning, Watson, can conceal much. Yet when ambition turns to crime, it cannot forever escape detection." As Mortlake was led away, whispers rippled among the onlookers, some uttering pity, others condemnation. I could not help but reflect that the fall of such a man carried with it not only his own disgrace, but the tarnishing of the institution which had harboured him. In that moment, the venerable college seemed to shudder under the weight of betrayal, as though centuries of honour had been stained by one man's corruption. The following morning, Holmes directed that the contrivances within the crypt be dismantled. With patient care, the wheels, pulleys, and hidden levers, those engines of deception, were removed and laid bare before the dons. The ropes, once instruments of terror, now hung lifeless and inert. When at last the bells were struck by honest hand, their solemn tones rang out without menace, stripped of the mystery which had so long cloaked them. To my ear, their sound seemed almost a benediction, as though Oxford itself were relieved of a spectral burden. Holmes, regarding them with quiet satisfaction, remarked, "Superstition thrives upon secrecy. Once the mechanism is exposed, the terror vanishes with it." So it proved. The college, which had quailed beneath the imagined curse, now breathed freely again. Fear departed, and with it the shadow that had lain upon those ancient stones. From the wreckage of the library fire, Holmes contrived to recover the very manuscript which Mortlake had sought so ruthlessly to obtain. Scorched at the edges yet intact, the vellum pages gleamed with the vivid colours of their illuminations, the artistry of a bygone age preserved by a miracle of fortune. Holmes delivered it into the custody of Dr. Henslow with a stern admonition. "Guard this treasure well, Doctor. Let it serve the cause of knowledge, not the vanity of possession. Too often has scholarship been perverted by ambition, and too readily has reverence been replaced by greed." The fellows, gathered about the volume, murmured their appreciation, though I fancied that some faces betrayed lingering shame at how close they had come to losing it through their own negligence. For myself, I could not but marvel that so small an object, a book, should have been deemed worth the price of lives and honour. Yet in that frail manuscript lay both the lust of Mortlake and the justification of Holmes's labours. That evening the dons assembled once more, not in fear but in acknowledgement of the man who had delivered them from their delusion. Words of gratitude were spoken with solemnity, yet beneath them I detected the sting of wounded pride. Learned men who had prided themselves upon their reason now confessed, some reluctantly, some humbly, that they had been duped by shadows. Dr. Henslow, his voice trembling with emotion, expressed their collective thanks. "Mr. Holmes, you have given us more than safety. You have restored to us our faith in truth. For in our folly we mistook cunning for the supernatural, and in so doing betrayed the very principles we profess." Holmes inclined his head without flourish. Praise, I knew, was to him but the incidental accompaniment of duty. Yet as I looked upon that company, I perceived that the greater lesson was not for Holmes, but for them. That reason must be guarded with vigilance, lest superstition creep in under the guise of reverence. Later, as we walked together through the quiet quadrangle, the moonlight silvering the ancient stones, Holmes spoke with that rare touch of gravity which marked his deeper moods. "You perceive, Watson, how thin is the veil that divides reason from superstition. A clever man has but to sound an old bell, and the learned tremble as though judgment were upon them. Yet behind the toll there lies only avarice, patient and remorseless." He paused, his gaze fixed upon the tower where the 3 bells hung silent. "Superstition, my dear fellow, is but a mask. Beneath it, men hide greed, fear, or ambition. Our task is to tear aside the veil and expose the visage beneath. For it is reason, and reason alone, that tolls the last bell for deceit." His words lingered with me long after, echoing more solemnly than the bells themselves. Thus ended one of the strangest cases it has ever been my lot to chronicle. The bells of Oxford, once deemed the heralds of doom, were revealed as no more than instruments in the hand of a schemer whose brilliance had turned to corruption. Mortlake's name passed into infamy, while Holmes's triumph was spoken of in reverent tones throughout the university. For myself, I felt both relief and awe. Relief that the shadow had lifted, awe at the power of Holmes's mind, which had pierced darkness where all others faltered. Yet as I left those venerable halls, I could not suppress a final thought, that even in Oxford, with its centuries of learning, the human heart may still harbour ambition black enough to toll its own knell. Holmes and I lingered in the quadrangle long after the last echo of Mortlake's downfall had faded. The tower loomed pale against the sky, its bells at last stilled. Holmes, with his hands clasped behind his back, spoke with quiet emphasis. "Superstition, Watson, is but the shadow in which avarice flourishes. The bells told not of judgment, but of one man's greed, and reason was the only chime that silenced them. And now, a question for you. What do you think was Dr. Mortlake's gravest mistake? His ambition, his deception, or his faith in fear itself? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this mystery intrigued you, be sure to subscribe for more cases of deduction and share this story with fellow lovers of Holmes.